Okay, cool. Hey, everybody who's here. Thank you so much for joining us. My name's Joe. I'm part of the Lower East Side Cactus and Succulent Society. And this is our second lecture in a series of 3 lectures that we are presenting with the gracious help of Dover Street Market. And just before we get to the lecture, I just want to say a little bit about us. So we're a very small and new cactus and succulent society that is focused and mainly concentrated here in New York City. And we've been doing this for a little over a year now. And we have monthly meetings, and we're now opening those meetings to the public, which if you follow us on Instagram or check out our website, and I can link both of those in the chat, we're going to be sending updates about those meetings there. So if you are curious about coming to more of these meetings and being a part of the group, that's definitely the best way to find out more about that. And so today, for our second lecture, for those of you who weren't here last week, we're just going to have one presenter, and it is going to be our friend Matt Dunaj from out in LA. Matt and I met, I think, 2 summers ago at the Cactus Store here in New York, which big shout out to Cactus Store. They're really are a foundational part of this group, and we love them and love what they do. But yeah, we met there in New York, and I've been following his work ever since, and he is just a really interesting collector and a very knowledgeable person when it comes to a lot of cactus and succulents, but specifically Welwitschia. And that is going to be the subject of his talk today. So without further ado, I guess I'll introduce Matt and let him start this off.
Thank you so much. Am I visible?
Of course.
And can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Can you see my, you can see my video as well?
Yeah, we got the lecture, or the presentation, and your video.
Great. Okay. So my name's Matt. I grow Welwitschia. I built a geodesic dome. I don't know how to see what you guys are seeing, so we'll just have to hope that it's in the frame there. This is my cactus greenhouse. I built this a few years ago, and it houses my cactus and Welwitschia collection. Welwitschia is not a cactus, it's not even a succulent, but it somehow found its way into the xerophile community as a desirable and interesting plant that people like to grow. Here's a few of my Welwitschia here. You can see that I've got them in raised beds and pots, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that later. But just to give you a little bit of background about Welwitschia, well, and also I'm gonna have to move around a bit. It's about 105 degrees inside the dome today. My computer overheated, so that's why I'm on my cell phone. So Welwitschia is a plant that's native to Namibia. And what you can see here looks like hundreds and hundreds of leaves. But the Welwitschia only grows 2 leaves its entire life. Those are just 2 leaves that have been frayed by the wind over hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. This plant in this photo is probably close to 2,000 years old. They live to be between 1 to 2,000 years in habitat. And they're a very ancient plant. They haven't changed really at all in tens of millions of years. Let's go to the next slide. This is a botanical illustration of the plant, so you can get a better sense of what it actually looks like. It's got like a woody head, and from that head, it pushes out 2 leaves like a conveyor belt for its entire life. And it doesn't flower, it makes cones. You can see the cones in the top illustration there. The plants take usually about 14 years in cultivation before they will cone. And there are male and female plants. So if you wanted to pollinate, cross-pollinate Welwitschia, you have to have one of each sex. And so with such a long time period between, you know, seed and when they're ready to reproduce, and the fact that you have to have one plant of each sex in order to reproduce them, makes it a pretty difficult plant to find in cultivation. There are a few specialty growers that cultivate Welwitschia, but it's not widely distributed. So it does make it a fun challenge to track down a Welwitschia of your own and to take care of it in a way that will hopefully get it to reproducing age of 14 years old. Let's go on to the next slide. You can see how big they get in habitat, the size of a small truck. We can go on to the next slide. So we could go back to that map. The red area is where Welwitschia is native, but we'll talk later about where they used to live and how did they end up here in Namibia. Welwitschia can only be found in the Namibian desert. They live on a very dry coastline where the sole source of precipitation, not the sole source, but the predominant source of precipitation is fog, a coastal fog that comes in and gives a lot of the plants and animals in that area the sustenance they need to live. It's similar to the fog in Chile that helps sustain the Copiapoa population in Chile, called the Camanchaca. The fog is called the Camanchaca. And let's go on to the next slide. You can see there the fog rolling in off the ocean over the dry desert. The Welwitschia, they gather water through their roots, and so they're collecting water, this small drops of dew that are gathering in the ground and percolating down to their roots. It's a really resilient plant that's able to grow to massive sizes and live for thousands of years with very little sustenance. It's a Jurassic ancient plant. That's a lot of the reason that it is so able to withstand those conditions. Next slide. You can see other animals in the Namibian desert live off the fog. This is a beetle that cocks its body up at a 45-degree angle and lets fog pass over it. And as the water gathers on its body, it's the water that it uses for sustenance. Next slide. Another example of how large this plant can get and how amazing those leaves look when they get tattered and frayed over the years. It's really just two leaves that grow out for its entire life. We'll go to the next slide. In habitat, there's not really a risk of poaching Welwitschia. They're really big and they would be next to impossible to safely pick up out of the ground and relocate. They're also very ugly. Most people wouldn't find this habitat plant a desirable lawn ornament unless you really knew what went into its creation. There's also a lot of landmines in their habitat where they're located, so that prevents some poaching as well. Let's go to the next slide. You can see that even when they are trimmed back to, can we go back one slide? Even when they're trimmed back to very, very close to their head, they're able to survive, they're able to recover, they're able to continue to push out new growth. Now I can go to the next one. What's really interesting about the Welwitschia is its fossil record. This is a photograph of fossils that were found in Brazil of Welwitschia cones. And Brazil's obviously on a completely different continent than the Welwitchia's current habitat. They've also found Welwitschia fossils in China. And this plant has been around for tens of millions of years. It used to cover the earth. It used to be on every continent. A planet covered in Welwitschia-like giants. And they've survived multiple ice ages even. But the only location on planet Earth that they were able to survive in into modern times is the Namibian desert. And it's just really remarkable to consider the change in environment that this plant experienced, going from covering the world, which was a lush jungle rainforest at the time, to now only clinging on in a very, very dry desert, sustained by a thin fog. It's a very special plant. So that's another key to the desire for conservation of this plant and propagation of this plant is respect for its age and appreciation for its journey. Next slide. This is an example of a male cone on a Welwitschia. And if you go to the next slide, that's an example of a female cone. So you can see the difference visibly between the two different types of cones. I've only had one Welwitschia in my possession flower. It flowered for the first time last year. And it's one of the ones that I have in the bed here. And I have a second one that is going to flower this year. So for the first year in my collection, I'm gonna have two Welwitschia flowering. I know that the one that already flowered is a male. I'm hoping that the one that is yet to flower is a female so that I can cross-pollinate them and produce seed to continue propagation of this plant. Let's go on to the next slide. You can see there the pollen on the cone of the male cone. And the next slide. And there's an illustration of the female cone. So you can get a sense of what they actually look like. They're very beautiful. They're like a deep red, ruby red color. And the next slide, you can see here by the price tag on this plant that it is difficult to find in cultivation. And when you find a large mature one, they can be very expensive. We'll go on to the next slide. This is the plant that I purchased, the largest Welwitschia that I've purchased. I found it on eBay, local pickup only, 14-hour drive away from me. So I purchased it, got in the car and drove out there, and I met the man who grew it. He was a farmer and he had a greenhouse full of them. And he told me that every few years he liked to sell them so that he could see what type of people he would meet that were interested in this plant. So there's a kind of community that forms around these interesting and difficult to find plants. Next slide. This was my collection before I planted any of them into raised beds. And the next slide. You can see there they are in the raised beds when I first put them in. I don't know if they're side by side. They've been growing very well in here for the last couple of years. I have bottom heat, bottom of the bed, so that in the wintertime, if the temperature of the soil ever drops below 50 degrees, this electrical coil will turn on and keep the soil warm. I think that that's probably the biggest boost to the growth that I've been able to do for Welwitschia is keeping their roots warm. It's very rare that it's necessary in Southern California. It's only a few nights a year, but I do think that it makes a difference. Next slide. There's one of mine that's now grown to be much longer. I don't know if you can see how the leaves are very leathery and they twist, they kind of spiral out from the central. But you can see how much that plant has grown just in the last year. They can push out about, when they're fully established, they can push out probably 12 to 18 inches of new growth in any year. But then the tips of them are dying back as it's growing out. So it continues to get longer, but it does have a cycle of growth and then die back. Next slide. You can see this is a photo of when the first flowering event started to occur on my male Welwitschia that I mentioned earlier. So you can see the cones starting to push themselves out of the apex of the stem. You can go to the next slide and see the progression as the cones continue to emerge. And then in the next slide, you can see they continue to grow up. They eventually, this time lapse doesn't capture their entire growth period. They get to be 12 to 18 inches up above the plant itself, that stem. Next slide. You can see a handful of them for sale at a local nursery. They are very difficult to find. They're difficult to ship because their roots are very sensitive. And if their roots are damaged, then the plant could die. It's also an interesting plant in cultivation because you would expect a plant growing in the Namibian desert to not need much water. But I water my Welwitschia almost every single day in the summer and about once a week in the winter. I don't have a dormancy period where I stop watering them like I do with the rest of my cactus plants. And if there is a next slide, that might be the final slide.
Yeah, that one's the final.
All right. That's my Welwitschia presentation.
Thank you. I mean, there's so much in there that I had no idea. The Brazil thing is really crazy to me.
Yeah, that blew my mind when I learned that this plant hasn't been in Namibia its whole life. It's traveled the whole world, really.
It's so crazy. Would you mind giving us a little tour of the dome while you can?
Yeah, sure. So I constructed this dome using just standard wood, and I got this plastic called Solex. It's a greenhouse plastic, kind of like a corrugated plastic. The geodesic design was intended to look cool, but also to efficiently spread light, have basically 360 degrees of light for all the plants. I purchased some plans online from a guy based out of the UK. His name's Paul Robison. He's got a bunch of great geodesic dome plans. And so I built this a few years ago. It had a prior home about 400 feet away from here. And because of the land use that area, I had to pick it up and move it. So when I moved it, I built some raised beds to plant some of these plants in. So I've got my Welwitschia bed here and a couple of them in pots. You can see these are what the seedlings look like. These are probably 3 or 4 years old. They're really not going to get any bigger than that until I pot them up into a bigger pot. And I've got another bed for Copiapoa. Most of my collection is Copiapoa. It's a Chilean plant. It shares the fog-like habitat of the Welwitschia. But I've got other various plants as well. But 2 Copiapoa beds and 1 Welwitschia bed. It can get up to 140 degrees in here. I've got venting windows in the top that open automatically when it gets to a certain temperature. It's not electronic, there's like a wax in a cylinder that melts and expands and pushes out the rod that opens the window. And then when it cools, it contracts and closes automatically. I've got running water and electricity in here too. But yeah, it gets to like 140. I've got fans going right now. Right now it's 100 degrees in here. It's about 85 degrees in LA today, I think. So it does a really nice job of keeping things very hot, but without burning the plants. The Solex panels diffuse the light really well. So it's pretty much evenly lit everywhere you look.
It's really exquisite. It's such a cool space. It looks so cool on video too.
That's good.
Yeah. Could I ask a few questions just in regards to growing Welwitschia and like what you found work for you, and then we can open it up to, I think there are some other questions in the chat. But sure. So I know not too much about this plant. That I've only had mine for about a year and a half. And the general rule of thumb that I've heard is that you want to keep them relatively moist, like never let them fully dry out like you would another, a cactus or a succulent plant. And I know, a big part of why we founded the LESCSS was to share information about growing specifically in New York, because a lot of the information you find about growing other cactus and succulents is more specific to the Southwest and other arid places. So I don't know how you're treating your plants is going to translate to how someone in New York might care for a Welwitschia.
Yeah.
But
Yeah,
yeah, what
I've
in
got,
terms of
yeah, I think that it's harder in somewhere like New York, because what I found the most success with my Welwitschia is giving them as much space as possible to grow in. If I keep the seedlings in those small pots for the next 5 years, they're not going to get significantly bigger. But if I up pot them into a bigger pot, the head's going to get larger. It's going to get larger over the next couple of years. So my advice to you, if you're living in New York, is start with a small seedling, because you can keep it alive for a couple of years in a small pot like that. You definitely don't want to let it, I wouldn't say keep it moist at all times. I think it's okay to let them get dry. You just don't want them to get bone dry. You're not going to let them get as dry as you would a cactus. And as you probably know, if you're growing cactus, there's a period of a few months in the wintertime when you don't want to be watering most of your cactus. You want them to go dormant. That's not true of the Welwitschia. But at the same time, when it's colder, I'm not going to keep them as moist. I'm going to water them about once a week. The soil is going to retain that moisture a little bit longer, and it's not going to dry out as fast. So I'm not keeping them as watered in the wintertime. Temperature is also important. You don't want them to get too cold, although they're pretty resilient, and it's really mostly the roots that you don't want to get cold. I'm fairly certain that the bed that I have these plants in retains heat in a way that the pots that these larger plants are in don't, because these plants are older, they're more mature, they're larger, and they have not flowered yet. But these two plants, after being in this bed for 1 to 2 years, have already started to flower. So I do believe that bottom heat is important, especially if you're somewhere cold like New York. I don't know if you're trying to grow inside an apartment, maybe a heating pad, which I know is common for people doing indoor grows of other cactus and seedlings and things like that. And just try to let it grow up. You want to try to continue to upgrade its environment in a way that it can get bigger. The goal of growing your Welwitschia should be to get it to flower. That's kind of the ultimate achievement. And then from there, either get two to flower, a male and a female, or find somebody else who's got the corresponding sex so that you could have a little play date and cross-pollinate. But I mean, if you've got a greenhouse in New York, then no problem. If you've got a greenhouse or access to a greenhouse or a hothouse or something like that, it's just all about managing your greenhouse and keeping the temperatures above 50 degrees in the wintertime if possible.
Have you felt like where does that 50 degrees mark come from? Is that something you found as someone who's been growing them, or is that like in your literature about plants?
That's just kind of that's just like when I look at the weather and I see like, oh, it's starting to get below 50. That's kind of when I'm like, oh, okay, I need to pay more attention to the temperature right now. It's not no scientific basis, just an arbitrary number for me.
Got it. One other question, just in terms of Welwitschia care, especially for beginners, is a lot of times when you find these plants online for sale, you'll get pretty small seedlings, like year-old maybe, and they come in like these plastic containers that look a little bit like a pipe bomb, basically. And my experience is that people get very nervous about repotting because they don't want to disturb the root system. And in my experience, we were talking before we started the lecture, but just I spoke with someone who basically said that it was totally fine, as long as you're doing it in the right season. Repotting is pretty safe. Is that something that you could speak to at all?
Yeah, I mean, every time I repot a plant, I get a little bit nervous because you're stressing it out a little bit. It's fine where it is, and you're trying to put it somewhere else, and there's always risk involved there. But if you want to grow the plant, you've got to repot it. So you kind of just have to do it carefully and responsibly, and everything's going to be fine. With Welwitschia, I do try to disturb the roots as little as possible when repotting. What that usually looks like for me is I place its existing pot inside the larger pot that it's going to live in. I backfill a little bit of soil, and then I either cut away or break away its previous pot so that it just sits there just like it was before. I gently add some more soil. You know, I'm not kind of trying to get the roots totally bare. I'm just gonna let them do their thing. And I found that having that kind of conservative approach of just gently letting them get into their new habitat, their new home, has worked really well for me. You want to put them into some soil that's slightly damp but not completely soaked. At least that's what I do. And once you get them in there, just let them sit for a couple days. Don't water them in immediately. Kind of let them chill for a little bit so that they can get acclimated. And if you did damage any roots, they can try to heal over for a couple days before you start flooding them with more water. Because the risk is that you're going to damage the roots and then it's going to rot and then the plant's going to die.
Right. I'm going to open it up to the Q&A section, which if you want, I can just go through each question and relate it to you if that's easier.
Yeah, that'd be great.
The first question is, who is the cartoon guy on the roof of your dome? Which is not, not exactly.
That's Lil B, the
but I'm curious too.
Lil B, the base god. He's my guru.
Oh, okay. Has he ever been out to the dome?
He's been out here, but it was before I built the dome. He's not. He has not graced its presence yet.
I feel like he's a real head.
Sorry,
okay, next question is from Chris. Okay, I'm just going to move on to the next question then, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Next question is from Christian, and it's in regards to the root depth equation. And he wants to know if you've noticed faster growth in the plants that are established in the raised bed, and do the raised beds connect to the earth beneath?
Yes and yes. I tilled the earth beneath the raised beds about 2 feet below ground level. And most of the soil that's in the raised beds is the dirt from the area where I excavated the dome. And it's a pretty sandy Chatsworth soil. So it works pretty well for the Welwitschia. And so there is no barrier or transition between the raised bed and the earth. Their roots can go below the raised bed and out as far as they would like. And the growth that I've seen on the plants in the raised bed is probably at least 50% faster and more vigorous than the growth of even the largest plants that are in the pots.
It's really impressive. Do you think, I mean, at this point, because in habitat, I don't know if this is true, but I've heard this anecdotally that Welwitschia roots can go so deep into the ground that they sometimes can reach the actual water, like deep groundwater, and that's is a potential source of water for them out in the Namibian desert.
Yeah, I've heard that. I've also heard that they have a shallow root system close to the ground. You know, they're frequently depicted as taproot style plants where they have a root that wants to go down very deep. Frankly, I think it's about as much room as possible for them. I think the deeper they can go, the better, and the wider they can go, the better. I don't see any reason to try to contain this plant within a pot if you have the option not to. I think it's going to do better the more space it has.
Cool. All right, next question. Zach is asking about the kind of radiant heat you use in the dome and whether it's just in the raised beds or if it's on the entire floor of the dome.
Yeah, a radiant heat floor on the entire floor is my dream greenhouse. That's my next greenhouse. This one only has it on the Welwitschia bed. And all it is like a $30 black electrical plug. I plugged it into the electricity in the dome, coiled it down at the base of the bed, a couple feet beneath the surface. ground level. And I frankly don't even know if it works. I've never tested it. I've never come out here when it's cold and like stuck a thermometer in the ground to verify that it's actually turning on. It might just be a security blanket for me, but it couldn't hurt. So that's all it is. It's kind of, you can buy these things for like East Coast raised bed gardening, where you need some radiant heat inside your garden bed. I think any garden supply website should carry it.
Cool. One question from Greg is, are you aware of people trying to create like a habitat style look in terms of growing Welwitschia, where like you're, going for the frayed leaf look, or is that something that just occurs naturally no matter where you're growing it?
It occurs naturally no matter where you're growing it. Like, let's see. You can see here how it transitions from like supple, healthy green down to frayed. And people, you don't have to try to do that. It just does it on its own. In terms of like a habitat look, these plants look very coddled compared to habitat plants. If you wanted to look like a habitat plant, like planting it outside would be the way to go. But it's challenging. You can really only do that in California, I think. I don't think there's many other states. Maybe Arizona, you could do it too. Actually, I think there are a couple in the ground at a greenhouse in Arizona. I heard a story about one that was in the ground in San Diego, outdoors, that was doing really well. Sometimes you'll see them in beds inside of greenhouse conservatories, botanical gardens. They'll sometimes plant them in like a larger version of the raised bed style that I did. Oh yeah, I lost my train of thought.
No, good. I know of one on the East Coast. There's and somebody mentioned this already, at the Smith University or Smith College Botanical Garden up in Northampton. They have a pretty impressive one in their houses. And it's the same thing. It's in one of their raised beds.
Yeah.
Next question. We have actually a few questions just about repotting. One is if you have a general rule of thumb for length and width for uppotting the Welwitschia, and the best time of year to consider repotting.
Yeah, I always try not to repot my plants in the winter. I always prefer to do it in the spring, or usually not the summer. If I'm like desperate to do something, I'll do it in the fall. Honestly, I don't know if that makes any difference. It's just kind of my own, that's when I get around to doing it. In terms of the size of the container, like I said, as big as possible to within reasonable extent. If you're taking a seedling that's in say a 9-inch pot, then you might want to go a 9-inch deep pot that's only 4 inches wide. You might want to upgrade to like an 18-inch pot. Maybe try doubling the size of the container each time you uppot it. With that goal of continuing the growth of the plant. But you also don't have to feel pressured and rushed to uppot it. If you're in a situation where the best way that you can take care of this plant is in the pot that it came in, and you're not really prepared to put it in something bigger, you can keep them in the small pot and keep them alive and happy for a very long time. You'll want to eventually uppot them to give them the life that they're looking for, but you don't really have to feel rushed to get them into a bigger home immediately.
Next question is about flowering, and someone's wondering how often the plants flower for you.
So they flower once per year, once per season. And it's kind of a continuous flowering. It's not like it just pops up this cone and then it closes the next day. Once it flowers, it stays flowered or coned for about 2 months, maybe 80 days, something like that. I do see signs of the plant that flowered last year starting to flower again this year, cone again this year. And from my experience, or not from personal experience, but from what I know about the plant, once they reach flowering age, they'll typically flower each season.
When is flowering season for you out in LA for the Welwitschia?
They kind of start, they're very confused right now because it's been such a hot winter and a very dry, humid winter. But they'll probably start pushing up these flowers in like February for me, and then through like March to April they'll have cones up, and then once it starts getting hot in the summer, their cones kind of frizzle and die off, and then they just kind of turn brown and break off the plant.
Last question now is about humidity. And Greg is just asking how your plants respond to high humidity. He has a greenhouse, but it gets 75% more percent humidity in the winter.
Yeah, I think that'd be fine for Welwitschia. You know, like I said, the cactus, you know, I can't experience because it is so dry here in California. I used to have a in my dome that I would turn on to bring the temperatures down, and that would jack up the humidity significantly, but only for short periods of time. I wouldn't be worried about it as long as you got temperature up and you're not getting it too cold in there. I think humidity would be totally fine.
And I was lying. Sorry, there's one last question, and it's just about the soil mix that you use for your plants.
Yeah, various. You know, I like to use something very well draining. For the raised beds, I use the soil that I excavated from the ground to place the dome here. It's like a very sandy, desert-like soil. I did augment it with some, probably like 20% organic matter, just like organic plant material. But, you know, I mix it up. I like to use a lot of pumice, you know, as much as 50% pumice in some plant mixes. And then the other half just organic, like basically compost or soil, garden soil, whatever you want to buy. That's just, you know, the hippie looking thing that doesn't have all the weird perlite in it and stuff.
Right.
I'm not really like, I'm not too particular with that kind of stuff. I haven't really gotten into that side of it. I just plop them in what works for me and try to take the best care of them that I can.
Seems to be working.
Yeah.
And to further go into that question, there are a few of us at LESCSS who are growing Welwitschia here in New York. And at least for me personally, I'm definitely using I'm using a mix that's pretty high on pumice and lower on organic, just so you can give the plant a bit more water than the other plants, but it's not staying like super soggy. And so far so good for me. I haven't lost any plants and they've been growing pretty happily.
Yeah, that's a good tip. That makes a lot of sense.
That is that's it in terms of the question. So I just want to say thank you so much for doing this. It really was incredibly it was just great. It was so good.
Thank you guys. Thank you for
and for anybody who's like curious, who follows us, yeah, of course. For anybody who follows the LES Instagram page or our website, we tagged Matt in today's post. So if you want to check out his stuff, that's a good way to see more cool pictures of his greenhouse.
Can I just also add, Joe, this is Daphne, that we have recordings of these talks on DSM's YouTubes for anyone that missed or would like to rewatch Matt's presentation. That'll be up there as soon as we have the recording.
Amazing. Yeah, and we'll for anyone who follows our Instagram page as well, we'll be posting those. We'll send links to those as well. And just a reminder to everybody who's here today, this is lecture 2 of 3. So we have another lecture here next week at 4 p.m. where 2 of our members are going to be talking about the time they spent a group trip down to Chile. And so they're really cool and tell your friends, and hopefully see you guys next week. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.